Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yep.
Okay, great. Right, so I'm gonna do a quick recap. I think we ended on this slide.
Yeah.
And then we can start talking about co-regulators. So if we start from the very beginning, the idea is that we want to be able to take some information about a social situation and map that into a formal system that is able to capture some of the ideas that we've been talking about in STP, including scale, intelligibility, uh, uh, instead of simply describing it in terms of like a dynamical system where kind of all the variables are already known, we want there to be the possibility of some complex or emergent phenomena. That's one of the goals, right? We also kind of want the same, some of the same tools that have been developed in other places, like I would say like cybernetics and the general like sciences, but we want to kind of obey this caveat from Rosen that mechanistic systems are not the same as living systems, that there's some kind of space for final cause or kind of this teleological aspect of things. So memory evolutive systems gives you all of those, right? If we're, as STP, if we're looking for a formalism that can capture the ideas we have, we're not satisfied with cybernetics, we're not satisfied with systems theory. We want something appropriate, more on the lines of Bogdanov, more appropriate for organizations in general, including things that can model like political action in the world, in a multi-layered world. So we started with this idea of patterns, right? The basic minimal building blocks of evolutive systems. And patterns have two parts. They have a sketch, which is a graph, and they have the implementation, which is the mapping of a graph into a certain category. And when you start to map this or implement this sketch, you start to distinguish special objects in the category that have a relationship to this pattern, right? Not every object in your category is going to have a relationship with a pattern. The ones that do, we want to discuss those properties. So one special object would be the cone. The cone is an object that has collective links from all of the objects of the pattern, and they obey a certain rule regarding the composition of arrows. And here we said something like, we used the case of a manager for a group of employees, that they somehow the interactions between the employees can be summarized or encapsulated in the manager. But again, with the caveat that this is not a lossless process, right? There can be more in the lower level interaction. We only care that a certain composition is preserved, which is dependent on the type of arrows that our category even starts with, right? For example, in the case of managers in a hierarchical chain of command, it's more about, for example, the effectiveness of the organization in making money, right? Making more profit, for example. From that perspective, yeah, you can summarize the interactions between employees, but this might not be true in any organization, right? In a political organization, you might have a leader, but it doesn't summarize all of the relevant facts. So you may not, the leader may not be a co-limit. It may just only be a cone. So yeah, and that also brought up the distinction between cones and colimits. Cones are these things that have collective links to the pattern, but the colimit is one that has a special relationship to all the cones. So here the example of train stations. Each train station connects the neighborhoods together, but there can be one special train station that kind of connects all the other train stations, right? From that train station, you can get to any other one. So it's kind of a central train station. And so the colimit kind of creates a optimal situation in some sense. It's distinguished with regard to the other cones. Another example we used was in the field of explanations for a given set of events, like for example, if you're a detective and you're trying to piece together or glue together a set of clues, the correct answer, or not the correct, the thing that explains everything, right? All the clues would be the colimit, and partial explanations would be cones, right? And it may be the case that you cannot solve the case. You don't have enough evidence. There's not enough clues, right? So there's nothing that guarantees that the colimit exists or that it's unique. But for it to exist, it must be both unique and with regard to the other ones, right? So this is the definition of the colimit as a solution to the binding problem. And I would say the usefulness of memory evolutive systems is very dependent on formulating the problem in the correct way, right? And if you want to use category theory, you need to define what are the objects, what are the arrows. You need to set up the problem so that you can define clearly what the colimit is. Right now, we're kind of in this metaphorical zone because we're just learning this from a conceptual level. But if you actually want to use evolutive systems to model things, you need very strict definitions of what allows for composition, what is the cost of an arrow, what information does the arrow transmit from one object to another. And once you have this well-defined category, then you can start talking about the binding problem and colimits.
Can we just try to explain what is the binding problem they're solving? Because sometimes I have the impression it means something like things are dispersed and kind of heterogeneous at this kind of micro level, but they are bound together, like they have some unity. How do we explain, that things are multiple in one level, but they're unified somehow? But the idea of colimits, like the idea that there is a network and then some element within that network, or at least let's say in the same level as that network, right? It has a special relation with other things in that network in such a way that I can actually treat the whole graph. I'm dealing with the whole graph. I can learn about the whole graph simply by looking at that element, right? So for example, I want to learn, it's true. So just to show what the difference is between my understanding, two versions. One is to say there is a territory that we call France, right? So you can ask yourself, how is it that France is unified, even though there are many people, they're bound together? But that's different. Like that seems to move towards a level of abstraction, or like to move from people to the country. Whereas from the point of view of what we've seen thus far, it looks like what they're saying is something like, yeah, but there are specific buildings and functions and things that people are bound to those things, like to the president of France. And I can deal with the whole of those people in that territory by dealing with the president of France. So it's flat, right? You didn't move from people to France, which seems like a unification that is more vertical. It actually looks more flat, right? Like many people, amongst them, there is a particular person to which everyone has a relation, and it's their binding to that person, which we usually like we mistake, or we kind of prefer to speak as if something like the country exists, you know?
Yeah, I think here the example you gave, I think it's a good way, because you're right, there can be a flat version and a vertical version. I think in the case of the country, the creation of a legal entity known as France would correspond to like the president is not just a normal citizen, right? It's the position has been elevated by legal means. So it is just another individual, but it has to be vertical. It is made vertical in some sense because of the law. So when we say that the interaction with individual citizens kind of composes with the collective link that these citizens have with the president, this kind of means that I'll put it this way: any interaction you have with France can be decomposed into something that is part of France, that's considered part of its collective radius, let's say. So, for example, let's say because we're operating at the level of countries, is something like declaring war or going to war with France. Well, going to war with France can be decomposed into attacking an individual part of France, which how do you know it's a part of France? Because it has a collective link to France. A citizen of France who's not in the territory of France, but maybe traveling abroad, if you harm that citizen, you're effectively attacking France. So, so it's not bound by territory, right? The collective links are they extend beyond the borders of France and so on. So, yeah.
But it seems to me like the core of the whole thing, like of the binding problem, is precisely to, let's say, analyze these horizontal links between things in the same layer, right? Like people or things and so on, in such a way that it's the same thing. Like you end up arriving at the same properties that are at stake when we talk about, there are the citizens of France, then there is France, like this sort of more layered, right?
Yeah. As long as the interaction, so starting at the interaction level, as long as that interaction can be decomposed back into the underlying pattern, we have a cone. Yeah. So every interaction you have with France, if it can be decomposed into interactions between some element in the pattern and its relation to the cone, to France. So if sending mail to a citizen of France is like sending mail to France itself, like that kind of thing. Then if that triangle relationship holds, right? You need three parts. You need basically an object from the outside, an object on the inside of France, and then France itself. If the interaction between the object on the outside and France can be decomposed into an arrow from the outside object to a part of France, and then from the part of France to France itself, then you have a cone. Then France is a cone.
So when they say the solution to the binding problem, they're trying to show that the properties we usually ascribe to these hierarchical levels, insofar as they are unifying levels, right? people who are now inside of France, and so on and so forth. The co-limit is a solution because we can arrive at those properties that look like properties of levels, unifying levels, in just by analyzing the links in a graph, right?
Yeah. Yes, there is a flattening happening in a way because France, as well as the citizens of France, as well as the institutions of France, they are all on the same, they're all in the same picture. And it's all just links between them, right? The links can cross levels.
Mhm.
That's kind of the interesting thing. It's not like you have one set of links for level 1 and then another set of links of level 2, and then you can't go between them. No, there's links between level 0 to level 1 and level 2, but it's all kind of on the same picture, right?
Yeah.
And you distinguish them by their relational properties.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like this because it's really good, content for Rodrigo's subtitle, like the title of his book, right? Neither vertical nor horizontal. This is
Yeah.
pretty much that. Like, it's not horizontal because the links have properties which are actually, hierarchical properties, but it's not vertical because there are no levels ontologically, right?
Mm-hmm.
They are relational. So it's neither one nor the other.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And any hierarchy that does form can be formulated as a temporary thing. It's not like once you have the hierarchy is just a convenient ordering of the objects that may disappear over time. It's
Yeah, I
not.
mean, I wouldn't say it's convenient in the sense that it's not real. It's just that, I mean, it still blocks certain things and still acts in reality, right? I mean, it's not like,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I see what you mean anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The real
Dennis, when you
power.
said,
Mhm. Go ahead, John.
oh no, finish whatever you're gonna respond.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying that the real power also really comes out when you project this in time. So when I say temporary and stuff, that all only makes sense when you have these co-limits and patterns, and then you see them as slices of this larger unfolding of the category. So then you really get the sense that that the structure follows some purpose or some almost like teleological thing, right? Then you can formulate phenomena that are more complicated than just like what is it at this moment. Like normally we get caught up saying, okay, you have a hierarchical system and this is like all of its departments and its parts, but that then you lose how is it that it became that way, and how do certain structures work better than others over time. But maybe this is a side. Yeah, John.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the France example, because you said earlier about to get beyond analogy, like we have to specify like composition rules, and I think that means like, right, we have to hold associativity and transitivity, right? Like that's the main. And I'm wondering if like would we be able to look at like how would that be like having two citizens having children? Like would it be the way that like citizenship is passed on? Would that be a way to actually define composition and the way these things pass around, or would it like, I guess I'm just trying to think through what defining that legalistically would be.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like with descendants, are your descendants two descendants of a descendant of two citizens is themselves a citizen? I would say that is a type of composition. So if you imagine the child having a relationship to France, and that relationship can be decomposed into the relationship between the child and a citizen of France, and then the collective link from that citizen to France. So the arrow from the child to the citizen would be one of like, is the child of, right? Is the child of X or whatever. And then from the citizen to the country would be, is the citizen of X. And then if you compose those two arrows, you get is citizen of X.
Yeah, that would be part of, I mean, this is where the concept of strategy you brought up last time comes in, right? That would be part of the protocol for reproducing the state, right? If you have two individuals, right, and there's a third, and both the previous ones were like, we should be able to account for the passing of citizenship ahead in terms of those three operations of absorption, scission, and elimination, right? Something like that.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, functor. If we imagine a functor from one moment in time to another, then the pattern would be gaining objects, right? So there could be more things happening in the pattern, depending on what the pattern is. If the pattern is consisting of every citizen of France, which would have as many objects in it as the population of France, then that pattern would be increasing over time or decreasing depending on what's happening with the population. Yeah, and then that actually brings up, I'll just jump to this part here because the stability span is how you would imagine this. It's a really important concept here because let's say you have France at the top, this circle, and then at the bottom you have two things. One is the red core, and the outer part is the pattern, the entire pattern, right? So if you imagine like the non-red part of the pattern, it's constantly changing. That could be something like the population of France, right? It's constantly, people are being born or gaining citizenship, or they're passing away, or they're revoking their citizenship. So that outer pattern is changing, but the inner one, the core one, must remain the same for the concept of France to be still valid or legitimate, right? So what is the essential pattern of France that would, if you were to remove this pattern, then France itself would either no longer exist or would be radically changed from its current state. So that, and the length of time in which this red core persists, that is the stability span. So basically this drawing here, it kind of gives you an intuition that things have a certain plasticity, right? Your brain is changing, but it still functions, right? You can have damage to your brain, you can learn things, you can forget things, but some core functions in your brain remain there until, like, you get Alzheimer's, or you get some dementia, and then that core deteriorates. Then you could say like the brain stops functioning. But we don't consider like, oh, you learned something new, or you forgot some facts about something. You don't consider that to be essential for the functioning of the brain. So that distinction is relevant when we talk about the co-limit. Yeah, so continuing there, we have mediation of links. This is the example again, right? You have a child, and they have a relationship to different parts of France, and then France would be the circle at the top here. And in this slide in particular, I was thinking of different perspectives or different aspects of a thing. So you have the taste, the feeling, the sound it produces, these would all be aspects of a thing, and then they all bind together into a concrete image or a representation of the thing in your mind, let's say. Yeah, and so there's some technical stuff here, like you need the maximal set of aspects that produces a perspective. So the perspective is not the individual purple arrow here. The perspective is a maximal set, meaning that all of these aspects are correlated to each other in some way. There may be some other thing here, some other base object, orange object, that can also perceive some aspect of the gray circle, but it's not correlated to the other orange circles, right? So it's not part of the perspective. The perspective has to be the maximal one, the largest one for this object. But you can also go further and speak of the individual aspects, like the sound that it produces. You can just talk about that, but it's not necessarily the perspective.
Yeah, that part I get a bit confused because, so the perspective, I mean, what is a property that a perspective is preserving, right? It's not just the arrows from the gray to the orange, right? And also, I mean, I wonder, shouldn't we have here the arrows between the orange points as well?
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
these arrows here, that something about them is preserved here, right? Like that I can take this path and going straight here is the same. Isn't this relevant?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, well, the pattern there's nothing that says you can't have a pattern of disconnected circles either. Like 5 objects with no arrows between them is still considered a pattern. But yeah, you're right. In the case where there are arrows between the objects of the pattern, what are called distinguished links, if there are distinguished links, then they must be preserved also, in the sense that traveling along the distinguished link should still yield the same result as going directly, like going purple then green should be the same as going purple, distinguished link, and then green.
Yeah, because like I feel like the core of all of this is understanding in which sense collective links are preserving like properties of patterns, right? Everything comes down to this, like that some, for example, when you talk about managers and workers, like the idea that, I mean, that would actually be a good example here, right? I think that they even use this example of a customer service being like an interaction between part of a company and something outside of it, and it's the same as interacting with a company, right? Like, isn't this one of the ways that they define?
Yeah, in this case, you're a customer, so you're the gray circle. Let's say there's 5 departments in a company. There are the 5 orange circles, and then there's the company itself. So when I'm interacting with the company, that means I'm interacting with one of the departments, right? So to say that the company is a co-limit means that any interaction I have with the company can be decomposed into an interaction with one of the departments, and then one of the departments, how it is absorbed into the company as a whole. But did that answer the question, or?
Yeah, no, it does. I was just trying to kind of clarify for myself, okay, like the for example, just going back before the definition of perspectives, right? Like the idea is that you have a pattern of workers, for example, in the sense that they interact in some way, and they also interact with their managers. So in such a way that, for example, for every action that a worker does with regards to another, there is also an action to their manager, which, let's say, captures the information of that, right? Like they report what they're doing. So
Yeah.
I can either learn about it straight from one worker to another, and then the action is reported to the manager, or I can go straight from the first worker to the manager and get the same information, right? And then you have the other fact, which is like this: if I have more than one manager and like two cones for both of them, I can also have links between the cones and so on, right? Like managers talking to managers. I'm just trying to understand, like when I say that there's this commuting relations there, yeah, it's true that, I mean, just for the sake of our own project, right? I mean, they are flat in the sense that everyone is, it's just people connecting or exchanging information, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah, sometimes certain constraints hold there, and sometimes they don't. But when they do hold, that's when this arises, right?
yeah, that's what
So-
I'm trying to understand exactly. What is the constraint is that for whatever interaction between the workers, I must be able to, let's say, capture, access that information straight from the manager, right? Like,
Yeah, I think it's easier or maybe better to go in the reverse direction to say whatever interaction between I have with the manager can be decomposed into a set of interactions with their underlying employees.
I see.
I think the customer service relation is good, if I'm understanding this right. And I also think like maybe when you're asking Gabriel about what property is being preserved, maybe one of the questions would be like the property of whether or not it commutes in the first place is kind of the question. In the sense like if I'm going in, if a customer is going into a fast food restaurant and the staff are putting on precisely the kind of performance that corporate wants to put them on, I can't really tell the difference between McDonald's as a particular company and any given employee within it. But when you have right now, like a lot of the things you've got on TikTok and whatnot of service workers kind of like pushing back against rude customers and stuff, like there becomes a place where the appearance of a company and like the relationship of it as McDonald's no longer commutes with the relationship of any of a certain set of employees with that company. And so it's like, I think the co-limit in a sense is like whether or not there's a co-limit indicates whether or not there is like a tension or like an antagonism in a sense, at least in the customer service version.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, there can be antagonism, and that's where the plasticity thing appears again. The thing with the stability span, where I mean you can have employees pushing back and employees can create their own standards for how they want to interact with customers of McDonald's or whatever. They can create their own standards, and then that may not be something enforced by McDonald's. I would count that as like the extended pattern, right? If we go to here, right, this green pattern, as opposed to let's say the red pattern is the official McDonald's, like if you don't do this, you'll be fired policies of the pattern, right? These are the distinguished links between employees that, and also with the outside customer, that are always enforced.
Like
And then-
essentially like a hard condition of continuing employment, like reproducing myself as employee.
Yeah, exactly. But then there's this like thickness to the pattern, right? Because pattern, well, we've been using the pattern as being like individual employees, but we can also think of a pattern as being behaviors. So if every object here is a behavior, then there's a core set of behaviors, which is the stable core, and then the outer set of behaviors, which can be, you know, whatever the employees decide to collectively do. They're still on the clock, but they're doing something differently than what McDonald's told them to do. I think, yeah, but then that we're getting a little further
Sure.
into what the formalism is capable of. But here, the only point is that you have this mediation of, you know, customer interacting with McDonald's can always be decomposed into a set of interactions with employees, and then how the employees are joined together in McDonald's, right? Through the employment contract, let's say. So let's say the green arrows are employment contract or employment relation. The purple arrows are, you know, like customer service, how the customer is received by the employees. So we're saying that any interaction between customer and McDonald's can be a combination of those two. Okay, so then once we have, now we've built this cone, and so we have this kind of higher order object to work with. Now we have links between cones, and those links can either be simple or complex, right? Simple links are links between cones which can be decomposed back down to their underlying patterns. So
And clusters are just, let's say, parts of patterns.
yeah, they're just a set of links between the
Yeah, the
one
cluster are the
pattern.
set. Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's multiple links drawn here and as like a plane
Mhm.
between the two circles, right? This blue plane, but it's just a set of links, yeah. And so when we say like, okay, let's have two McDonald's now, the employees of one McDonald's interacting with employees of other McDonald's, if they are according to the individual interactions, then if the total interaction can be decomposed into the individual interactions, then we have a simple link. But the complex link is the obstacle to reduction. So we cannot reduce a complex link to its underlying patterns.
Also, one thing I realized is that a complex link, it is always a composed link. It's never a direct link, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You never get a complex link where you have the purple arrows. You only get it with the blue arrows of trying to compose to purple.
Yeah, that's true. Right, and there always has to be one of the objects in the middle being having the multiplicity property.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I mean, not only having the multiplicity property, but being split by it, right? So that one arrow is coming from it and another is coming from the other, going from the other pattern, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you may not, I mean, it depends on your ramification, the unfolding that you do, but if you unfold it in such a way that you let's say you stop at the level of the blue arrow, you may not see this multiplicity property.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right though. Underlying, and anytime you see a complex link, you can assume there's an object that's split in the middle somewhere that's preventing a reduction to the underlying pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we start to depart from like a cybernetic approach to things, like, evolutive systems have everything like a feedback loop and have this dynamical description of learning from the environment and affecting the environment. But I don't think there's anything in cybernetics or cybernetic theory that describes emergence quite like this, that there is some kind of irreducible object inside of the system. And there's different ways we can approach it. We can approach it epistemologically, saying like there's no way to totally understand the system because there's like these degenerate objects can be understood in two different ways, and those two different ways are incompatible. So it's an obstacle to our understanding or our knowledge of the system. But we can also approach it through that the system has some inherent obstacle, some inherent complexity to it. That's not only our own understanding or the external point of view unable to comprehend it, but it's actually like something in the system itself. To use an example, like when we talked about Wolfram and the idea of like irreducible complexity that he puts forward, it's the idea that certain systems are so complex because you cannot predict the next step. You have to simulate it to see. Like you actually have to run the rule to see what it's going to do. You can't jump from at one point in time to another point in time by applying like a formula. This would be an example of.
Yeah, but don't you think that there is, I mean, I'm still trying to kind of point out why this idea of complexity sounds and feels so different for me, which is, I mean, something that I already felt with Rosen. Like, for example, just take this distinction, right? Like Wolfram talks about computational irreducibility very much in terms of, is it simulatable or not, right? And it sounds like a quantitative measure in the sense of, well, once you reach a certain level of complexity, you simply can no longer you cannot predict the future. You need to simulate the future. You can only, let's say, right? It's relational, which is cool because he's saying something like the world, like let's say a mathematical system or a mechanical system, it's less complex than something else, so that other thing can actually simulate and predict the future states of the less complex thing.
Right.
But if you're at the same complexity of the thing you're trying to understand, the best you can do is calculate faster. You cannot predict. You cannot skip steps and create a formula, right? And that sounds to me like it's interesting because it's relational. So you could have that problem. Let's say you restrict yourself to something of less complexity, like a mechanical system, and then you're as complex as the mechanical system you're trying to analyze, and then one thing might not be able to, can only run faster than the other thing. Like when you create a small physical model and it just gives you the future state of a large physical model that has the same properties, right? But it's still kind of complexity saying there, it still sounds quantitative, like there's hierarchy of complexities, and then there's some like Turing complete ones, that's the limit, and then something like this. Whereas here it sounds qualitative to me, like when you describe something, it's irreducible. I cannot decompose this thing into its kind of pattern in a lower layer or something like this. It sounds like an anatomy, it doesn't sound like it's just a quantitative measure. It sounds also more intrinsic as well.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, because in the computational way, in the computational interpretation, it's more like you just don't have enough memory or computational power to do it.
Yeah,
it's so complicated. Something like that, or like you said, it's relational. Like one system is just they're both the same complexity, so they can't. One cannot outpace the other one. But yeah, in this one, it's more like a qualitative split, that two sets of patterns have the same colimit is, it's not a quantitative relation, it's a qualitative, it's a property of special objects in the system. Again, it's like, it's not a vertical relation either. It's just a special object.
Exactly. The multiplicity principle is saying nothing of yes, you cannot decompose now this relation here, right, to just the clusters between these things here. But this doesn't say anything about computational power or compression, information, like it is relational, like some current ideas of complexity, like, yeah, you want to talk about compression of information, you need to mention the two systems, like the system being compressed and the system doing the compression, like that's relevant. But the multiplicity principle sounds like a much more structural view of complexity. Like, yeah, I'm just saying there are two patterns and that the same object is being caught up in this relation in two ways, that they're not, the same. That sounds like a really, really different way of saying something about complexity. Like, that doesn't imply it's too big, it's non-linear, right? All the things I would associate with complexity, a quantitative measure, length of programs, like it just sounds like a qualitatively different thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more of an obstacle to reduction. They define complexity in this negative sense, that it's just the everything else can be reduced to underlying patterns and link clusters between patterns, and this one cannot. It's a lack of a property that makes it right, and I think that's why they also call it a degenerate object.
Yeah, I don't know. I need to think about it. How I would pitch this to someone. Like, these guys have a different concept of complexity because it is three dots. Like, I wouldn't know what to say.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think I had very strong Freud vibes and like Lacan and psychoanalysis, because I feel like there's a lot to do with ambiguity, signifiers and stuff, but yeah, I don't know the right way to.
Yeah, the thing that really caught my I think that it would be worth always emphasizing also is that the only reason why the multiplicity principle is definable, right, that you can actually have two patterns for the same object, and they're not two objects, right? Because if they were two objects, they would have separate cones, and then you would actually have three relations at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
It's because there's a difference between, let's say, how to call this, like the well, why not, right? The multiple and the patterns.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, the fact that a multiple can have more than one pattern going on at the same time, that's like their basic ontological claim. It's not that strong, perhaps. Like, perhaps it's acceptable for most people, like, to imagine that, well, many things are happening at the same time in one thing, and it's enough that you can abstract others and keep one of them, right? Like, a person is at the same time engaged with others, and that forms a pattern of engagement, but it's also engaged with, their own biological maintenance, and that's different interaction with the environment, right? And an atomic interaction, like, these things can all happen at the same time. Like, I have the impression that that's a very strong kind of presupposition so that you can maintain this multiplicity principle.
Yeah. The example of the legal text I thought was really good from last time, which is like the same legal text can be interpreted in two different ways. They belong to two different patterns in terms of their impact on the space of legal decisions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's good because I mean, interpretation is a way of naming that the same substrate, like a bunch of letters, can have two patterns, two interpretations, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think it's always a matter of ambivalence, right? I mean, actually, this is actually quite interesting because I would compare these two examples. I think that they're really good to show what's at stake. Like one example is where you have like a text. We have interpretation 1 and you have interpretation 2. And well, there is some judgment you're making that connects you to this interpretation. And there's another judgment that is made because of that another interpretation, right? They're both connected to the same text. And then, well, the connection of one judgment to that text and the connection of another judgment to the text is not the same, doesn't say everything about the connection between the two judgments. It's a complex thing, right? But that's the two interpretations here. They seem to be kind of ways of, they're more of the sort of ambivalence or ambiguity, right? Whereas compare this to the idea that you have like I'm thinking things like what we are doing, where you have some social object and it exists as a pattern in mode A, it exists as a pattern in mode B. So like people interacting in a there is, let's say, their relations as citizens or property owners, but there's also their personal relationships as people who are creating bonds of reciprocity, kinship relations, and so on, right? And then you can have some interaction with this same object insofar as it is a personal thing, and you can have another interaction with this object insofar as it is a bunch of people. Like, for example, the example I gave in the chat last time. Imagine this is like an office space, right? So there are like the productive connections as laborers, the property relations and lawful relations, and there is the personal relations and so on, right? And let's say there is like somebody comes in and makes friends with people, right? So like from this perspective, like the boss is just a person, so they're jealous that somebody in the workplace made friends with this person they want to be friends with, and so on. But then at the same time, there is some decision made at the level of who is the boss of who. So it's the same place, the same people, but on this, like at the same time, they're friends and they're boss and employee, right? Like in this sort of scenario where you need to connect a decision based on personal relations with a decision based on property relations, it doesn't sound like ambiguity. It sounds like a different type of multiplicity, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but it's interesting. Yes, so multiplicity is kind of it can be split into different types of multiplicity. So ambivalence or something more textual and more interpretive, but there can also be this more like logical multiplicity.
Yeah, and also my impression is that, for example, I can say something like, yeah, I had like this workplace, and in some level, there was some interaction with the workplace at the level of reciprocity patterns, and there was some other interaction at the level of property relations. So I can understand these two arrows here, right? Like reciprocity relations with the workplace, kind of lawful relations with the workplace. But what does it mean that reciprocal and lawful relations connected, right? What this arrow would mean, it's harder to understand than in the case of two interpretations of the same text, right? Text, interpretation one, interpretation two, and then you have like the judge's decision here with regards to this text, and then there is another decision here, and you say, well, but the relation between these two decisions is not simple. It's undecomposable to the relations between the judgments and the text, right?
Mm-hmm.
This makes more sense to me. How do I talk about this thing here? Sounds more complicated, right?
Yeah, it does. But I mean, we already jumped ahead in the primer where we tried to come up with ways of crossing the layers, like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the sort of thing I'm trying to understand how we translate here, because I would say like it's ambivalent multiplicity where the patterns seem to be homogeneous amongst each other, and layered multiplicity where the patterns seem to be more heterogeneous with one another, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess you could say it's not really that heterogeneous, because ultimately reciprocity, contract relations, value relations are all social relations. So it's just social patterns that are different, but it just sounds a bit different, at least from the perspective we've been working on it, right?
Yeah, it maybe part of what STP is offering, like what part of our theory and everything is, it's not that we characterize every possible link. We just have like some basic links that we can do some partial decompositions of social relations, right? It may be that there are links that, you know, they have more information than what we're talking about, or what we can decompose. I don't know if that makes sense, but like we have these mode A, B, and C arrows, and then we say like, okay, there's you have a social world that's complex, it's multi-layered. In some cases, you can take some of these complex arrows and you can break them down into a composition of A and B and C. And so, yeah, maybe that doesn't characterize the entire social field, but it definitely helps to analyze some relations.
Yeah, I mean, regardless, I mean, we definitely should move on, but just I think it's important to see that. I mean, I'd say that like right off the bat, there are two things that clearly, at the point where you are in your presentation, clearly connect with things we already done and we should further develop. The first is the multiplicity principle sounds very much like the part of in all of this that is meant, like it's kind of meant to turn world, like to explain this, right?
Yeah.
Right. So there should be an interpretation in terms of decomposing patterns of how this is a complex, our whole diagram here is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a question that I would even ask right now is, I mean, we know that we can even interpret the direction of these arrows, right? Because these are the decomposable. You can decompose into pairs, though they were composed by triads, right? It's written, a certain type of complexity is kind of written inside this diagram.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So there is something, definitely something to think about there.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I think in your presentation is already clear is that this other diagram we've been working with, right? The idea that you have an individual that is kind of engaged with social mediation, and this is engaged with the social world in this commuting way. Especially if you add the other stuff we have here, right? It's political ecology and blah, 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 blah. This like when we add the other arrows of actions and constraints, this is not really a consistent thing, because ultimately there's like a bunch of individuals relating, right? And then there is something like the co-limit for all of these individuals, and this is what we call a social mediation, right? Which is like a hierarchy. And there is also the co-limit of all social mediations in the world, and that's kind of like the largest point of view of the world itself, right? But you should be able in some level to imagine that these are projectable, reducible back to the individual things. So to understand what we mean by actions, constraints, reductions on this diagram that we've been working on, there should be an interpretation of them in this kind of hierarchy building development, right? Even if it's just a synchronous version of it.
Yeah, we kind of jump scales in that.
Yeah, exactly. We jump scales. Like we say things like individual acts on an organization. Like, but what does it mean for an individual to act on an organization? An individual acts on other individuals in such a way that this is equivalent to saying that they are acting on the organization, right?
Right. Yeah.
So like this whole interpretation of that thing in terms of what you're doing, I think it's also like clearly another step we need to take further, you know?
Yes, and I think the later slides start to tackle this second issue. Yeah, I have no idea how to do the first thing you mentioned, which is the Bromian version of the multiplicity, but yeah, the second thing I think we can talk about today. Okay, so yeah, that's the multiplicity principle. It's confusing, but it seems promising. Then we have basically extending this idea. Like if you have multiplicity principle, that means that any unfolding of an object is kind of not complete, or it's going to have some issues because you're going to have this complex links showing up at some point in the unfolding. And when it does, it means you can continue unfolding, but what you have unfolded is going to be it's going to lose some information, right? There's something in the complex link that cannot be simply explained by the interactions of the lower level objects. So you can continue unfolding, but you just know that it's not a reduction in the sense of like explaining it, right? You can explain certain links. And this is what allows them to define complexity of objects, right? The complexity of an object is basically how many times you can unfold it before you hit a complex link. Right, and so there's some things that they're complex all the way down, they have complex links all the way down, but there might be some that, you know, you can actually decompose it multiple times before you hit a complexity point. Okay, so once we have this idea of different levels of complexity and also a hierarchy in which every level is the co-limit of some pattern in a previous level, you have this idea of a dynamic, which is a functor that maps one category to another. And if you turn this diagram, if you rotate this diagram, you basically get this, right? And this is one of their main points, is that objects don't start out necessarily complex. They become complex over time. So the same way that we can take one category and slice it into different complexity levels, we can take one category and slice them into different moments, each corresponding to a lower complexity level. So if you think about the evolution of life on the planet, the earlier stages of this are less complex, and then the later stages build on top of, or are the co-limits of the patterns from the earlier stages. So both time and complexity move together in general. Not always, right? Obviously, things can become less complex over time, but the phenomena they're interested in are these systems that are gaining co-limits and gaining complex links. So things are emerging over time. Okay. And then the one interesting or one kind of technical tool we have to describe links in time is that a single link, which we describe in a synchronous manner between two objects, it actually takes time to unfold, right? So if I'm interacting with McDonald's or whatever, I'm going in, I'm making an order, that's going to take some time. It doesn't just happen at once. Maybe from like a high level view, when you zoom out, it's just an instant link, and we don't need to care about temporal duration of the link. But if we want to zoom in to analyze the interactions between objects at a closer level, we need to take into account like the thickness of that link in time. So this is where the propagation time comes in, and it plays a larger role later on. But it basically says, like, if you want to compose the horizontal arrows with the vertical arrows here, you need a certain time to elapse before that composition is possible, right? So if you see this middle state here, I cannot draw a diagonal arrow to satisfy the composition here because not enough time has elapsed. Only after 2 steps, let's say in this diagram, only after 2 steps can I draw to say that there has been a link established between the object in the very first picture and the second object in the third circle here. So this composition in time, it represents how long it takes for links to propagate. And that'll become important in the next 2 slides. So yeah, we talked about strategies as being the thing that evolves the system forward. And this strategy you can interpret it as a teleological thing, as something intentional or goal driven. And that's kind of a useful way of thinking of it, because things try to achieve certain goals, and those goals can be thwarted. They can be successful, they can be thwarted, different goals from different parties can combine together to form a strategy. And so the distinction here between complexification and strategy is very much like the distinction between a scheme and the schema of a pattern and the implementation of a pattern. The complexification is like the implementation of the strategy. So it actually produces the next category going forward. But the strategy itself is an abstract thing. It's a collection of objectives. One of the objectives is the absorption of a new pattern. So a pattern that did not exist before now exists. The construction of a colimit, and then the deletion or removal of objects and links. And there's actually a fourth one here. I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but it's the construction of a limit. But since we haven't really talked about limits, we don't need to go into it.
Yeah, this is the part where I felt like yesterday. I remember last week, Rafael asked, okay, but is a strategy, like, does it imply intentionality and so on? And you were saying, no, it doesn't. It's just, let's say, a list of actions to be implemented, right?
Yeah.
And the basic form of these actions can only take three types of commands, right? Mm-hmm. Absorption, elimination, or binding. Right? And let's say how that list of commands is formed, it's not up to discussion right now, right?
Yeah.
That's something that, like, just stepping ahead a bit, like, that's something that co-regulators have a say on.
Yes.
Right? Like informing, okay, there are a list of things we're going to do from one step to another. What are these steps, right? That's where regulation comes in, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I separate properly, like what counts as a strategy is not a matter of determining, like, at this point, they're just saying, let's say, the basic grammar of a strategy is that it's going to absorb, eliminate, or bind,
Yeah.
Right. And many of these things in some order, we don't know what it is, right? In some time.
Yeah, many of these will happen, and why they happen or how they happen is left open. We can think of strategies as emerging randomly as a probabilistic process, or like the expansion of gas in a chamber. That is a strategy as well, right? Seeing how gas fills up a balloon or a chamber, it has different slices of time. It takes time to happen, and each slice has its own strategy for how it becomes the next slice, but it's totally a random process, right? But this grammar can be applied to both the random processes, but it can also be applied to intentional teleological processes. So it's very flexible there. Yeah, but it basically always has these three ingredients in different, right? Obviously, not all three has to be there. Like it could be absorption, but not the construction of a colimit, which is called binding, right? So it could be absorption with no binding, or absorption with binding, but no elimination, or all three, or some combination of the three. Yeah, and then we already covered stability identity, right? The core has to remain the same for this colimit to exist, and then the outer version can have some plasticity.
One thing that I was curious about this moment here, when you because you introduced the strategy part, not so much, but when you spoke of the thickness of time intervals and the taking of time, and also this slide here of the spans. I remember in the book that they say, look, this, when you think of complexity in this way, it becomes clearer that there is something like an intrinsic time and an extrinsic time, right? There is the chronological time that we would add, like just as at the bottom of a page, to say something like, yeah, in the passing of time here, we're just gonna consider like every 5 seconds a time unit, right? And there is the internal time in which those 5 seconds actually count as an instant, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this is actually really important to keep track of, because it is for social systems, that seems to be the difference between time and history, right?
Yeah.
History speeds up because a lot of updates happen very fast, like, whereas you can still say chronologically time is passing in the same way. And you can have, let's say, the end of history being understood as a certain kind of problem in the internal reproduction of these complex systems, like from the intrinsic perspective, like nothing new appears. Whereas in time, yes, of course it's appearing, right? So there's something there that I think has a clear interpretation in our approach as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think that'll become more clear with the co-regulators. But yeah, it's very interesting that almost all of the later chapters, like chapter 5 onward in the book, it's very, very focused on temporal concerns and constraints. It almost like stops caring about like what are the causes of different things, or what are the mechanisms that produce or cause changes to happen, but it's more about the temporal constraints to carry out certain things, and how those constraints come from all over, right? They come from below, like the constraints from below are the constraints coming from the smaller scale of time, and then there are constraints from above as well, from like the higher order co-regulators. But this this thing you're saying about like a history moving in a discontinuous way, I think it is captured here in terms of like a subjective time for different parts of the system. Another thing, to add to that is that memory itself is its own actor. Memory is a component of the system, or it's a the subcategory that when you say like a lot of changes happen at the same time, it's almost like saying the memory of the system is being updated more frequently. But yeah, there's something there that we can model. Yeah, so yeah, when we're talking about subjective time, we're basically talking about the perspective of a co-regulator. Co-regulators are subsystems whose components act together. So they're not a single object necessarily. They can be a set of objects that are moving in somehow working together, right? So there's a bit of ambiguity of this definition of what exactly constitutes a co-regulator, but what they're capable of is always the same thing. They can read and write from the memory of the system. So there's a central memory to the system. And the co-regulator can read from it and it can put stuff into that memory. It can also determine the overall strategy of the system, but possibly in a partial way. The co-regulator doesn't have complete say over the strategy, but it can have some say in it. And then it can also interact with other co-regulators. So now we've gone from patterns to co-limits, and then we've gone from co-limits to this temporal version of things where you have components that are traveling in time, as well as these higher order things called co-regulators, which are collections of components. So now we can move to this level and talk about from the perspective of a co-regulator, what does the system look like? The co-regulator has a landscape, which is its perception of the system. So if you think about we have the original category, which just defines the system at a certain time. That category is called the configuration category, and it's objective, let's say. But the subjective version of that would be the landscape, which is for every co-regulator, there's a version or subcategory of the overall category, which contains only what that co-regulator can perceive. So now we have the subjective phenomenology, but it's still objective because co-regulators are not people, they're systems, they're ecosystems, they're businesses. They can be anything that's complex. Yeah, so this idea of landscape is really important. And then on top of
sorry, just to make sure, because I know you're moving quicker with this. Like, we don't know exactly how because we were in such simple land very early, right? I mean, at half an hour ago, there were co-limits and complex links and hierarchies. And then we enter the diachronic realm where we have, let's say, we add like a temporal thickness to these relations, like it takes some time for them to establish themselves, and so on. But that said nothing of what memory means, right? I mean, is it implied that we can define memory simply with those concepts we already have, or are we kind of should we just take it for granted? Like, let's skip that because it's technically complicated, but there's something like memory, and then we're moving on, or is memory defined only on those concepts?
Yeah, I skipped memory. It's defined at the very end of the book, but for now we can just say it's a subcategory that has patterns. Okay. So memory is just a collection of patterns that the co-regulators share. Okay. It's like a common resource that any co-regulator can access and put things into, although no co-regulator necessarily has access to the entire memory.
I see.
So if you think about it, even in the physical body, memory doesn't have to be, like in the brain. It can be the memory of
muscle memory.
It can be muscle memory. It can be like you broke your bones and now you're healed. Your body is healed from the broken bone, but it still has some leftover artifacts or leftover scars from that healing process. That's considered memory as well. But it's still, so you can think of it as like it's a marking, or it's an artifact of some event in the past, that is available for other co-regulators to interact with. But itself is not really a co-regulator, because it does not interact. It does not actively interact with other things. It's just a passive repository of.
So like, just to be very vague about it, I could say like something in the sense of, you have a system, it's made up of patterns that interact. If I just consider this resource of patterns that is stored as a memory,
Yeah.
that's the thing that co-regulators are kind of looking into to get some info constraints for strategies.
Yeah. The co-regulator has two inputs, really. It's one input is the memory. So it can pull from some of the patterns that have been stored in the past. Not necessarily all, right? Again, the co-regulator doesn't have to have access to the entire memory, just parts of it. So that's one of the inputs. The other input is through something called the receptor of the system, or receptor is basically like, the receptor is basically like a set of eyes or sensory components of the system. So it takes information from all the co-regulators as well as the outside world. And there's a bit of ambiguity here, because on the one hand, you can model a co-regulator as interacting with other co-regulators, but then you can also model a co-regulator as interacting with these receptors that take in information. They are the eyes and the ears of the system. Yeah, here's a better diagram, I think. Yeah, so now we're zooming in onto the subjective world of an individual co-regulator. And in that subjective world, it has its own sense of time, which is determined by its what's called the time lag, or the latency of this co-regulator, which is, it's a smaller time scale than the overall time of the system. And it always has 3 steps that it needs to take. It has to decode information. It has to regulate something by changing something in the system, or attempting to change something. And then it has to encode those commands into something that the system understands, to convert that into a strategy for the next step. And if you look at these 3 steps, they basically correspond to the very first diagram here, right? Encoding, inferencing, and decoding. So instead of inferencing, we're calling that regulation, because that it's a more active term, right? Inferencing kind of implies that you're trying to discover something new, you're trying to increase your knowledge, but that's not always what the co-regulator is about, right? The co-regulator is trying to change the landscape of the world. So we call it regulation. So so what these 3 steps are is decoding forms a landscape from information that it receives from the outside world via the receptors. Again, the landscape is its model of the system. So it receives information from the outside world. It also takes information from memory, and then this creates a landscape. From that landscape, it can then decide what are the procedures that it wants to undertake. Procedures are basically they're like patterns, except they're patterns you can activate to send to the effectors. So a skill, for example, right? A skill, if you have a skill, then it is a pattern in some sense. There's a inactive version, which is stored in memory somehow, in your muscle memory or whatever. And then there's the active version, right, where it's being carried out. That division is kind of here as well, with you have the procedures that are stored in memory, and then you have the commands, which are the active elements of that pattern being sent to the effectors. Okay, so if you look at this diagram, we can break it down. The first picture shows the co-regulator within the category, and the left circle is describing a step, the beginning of a step, and the right circle is describing the end of a step.
Mm-hmm.
A step is basically the minimal time it takes for this cycle of decoding, regulation, and encoding to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So once we zoom into an individual step, we have these parts, the effectors, the memory, the co-regulator itself, and the receptors. So you start going left to right. You start with some information coming from the receptors, and then sometime later, some information from the memory. The co-regulator takes these two inputs and forms a landscape. And then from that landscape, it decides what it wants to do. So it chooses a procedure and sends the procedure to the effectors. And then also based on the outcome of what it sends, it can record something in memory. So basically everything you need to have like a trial and error, like an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Right? The co-regulator is always conducting experiments. It's forming some guess about what the world is, and then it's making some change, and then seeing how that change happened, or whether it was successful, or the results, and then it's taking that information and recording it into memory. So it has a basic learning cycle. If it's always the same duration, then this is a cyclic co-regulator. And the example here is like a heart, but you can think of other examples that are periodic, like I don't know, a school semester would be cyclic. Every semester of school, the school itself is learning something, right? It's learning about what the students want, what teachers want, and it may make adjustments, but it basically has the same duration every time. Okay, and then some other diagram, the very bottom right diagram, we have the names for the different delays. When we were talking about the thickness of time for the co-regulator, we can break it down into the input time, the kind of the deciding, and then the sending the command, which I like this because it reminds me of the Lacan's instant of the glance, time for understanding, and moment to conclude. I think that's kind of maps really nicely onto that. But yeah, basically you take some input, you construct some version of reality, and then you act on that. And this determines the latency.
I know what's a good practical example of how you can have these things. Like there is this problem of linearity in musical perception, because if you go below a certain bit per minute ratio, I think it's 30 bits per minute. If it's slower than that, you no longer perceive it as part of the same instant.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot create and integrate like bits that are slower than 30 bits per minute into like part of a pattern. You actually need to recall your memory of the previous one and act on top of it. So like, if for most people, if you have like faster rhythms, you can perceive a pattern, a rhythmic pattern. If you slow it down below 30 bits per minute, you're no longer perceiving the pattern, you're perceiving like a beat, then the next one, and trying to recall the previous one, but you're no longer, let's say, they don't belong to the same moment,
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting. Yeah, so like what we consider to be the present has a thickness of 30 beats per minute, like
yeah.
has to be that. Otherwise, it doesn't register as part of the same moment. And this is really important, because there's a bunch of co-regulators at different time scales, all interacting at the same time. And if one co-regulator has a time scale that is so much smaller than the other one, then it's almost like it's a continuous thing, right? There's no variation from the perspective of the higher level co-regulator. So yeah, basically, if you think of every co-regulator as playing a beat from the perspective of these slower, longer term co-regulators, these smaller co-regulators are either not playing at all, or they're playing like a continuous sound.
Like, I mean, one thing I don't get is the latency defined by, right? I mean, how is the thickness of an instant correlated with what happens inside of it, right? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's so, like, let me put it like this. One thing that's why I mentioned this history thing, is that it's interesting to see that the same hierarchy of scaling vertically in terms of what is part of what, right, and creating like co-limits and so on, you can also turn it on the side, and that's actually how you deal with the passage of time, right? That places kind of a sort of inner history, right, in the sense of a meaningful notion of time distinguished from just pure chronological time, very much at the, let's say, at a very kind of intrinsic primordial moment, right? That things have their inner clock, right? It's a very, very intrinsic property of very simple systems already from their perspective. But it's not clear to me what's the I mean, I see the connection between, from the vertical or the synchronous aspect, how the connections of links can produce stratifications, right? But I don't see how the passing of time and what happens in the temporal folding gets to determine how thick the moments will be,
Yeah.
Is there anything in this direction, like?
Yeah, there's basically a lower bound and upper bound. I don't know if this gets to the answer, but there's a lower bound on the how long a step takes. For first, I think there's a slide on this. Okay, well, we haven't gotten there, but basically there's a lower bound on how short the step of a co-regulator is, and that is the minimum amount of time it takes to do these three things of decoding, regulation, and encoding. Each one of these things takes time to do. The sum of that time is the lower bound. Then the upper bound is the stability of the components that are involved in these three steps. So if you think about it, the objects that the co-regulator is using inside of the co-regulator, they're not stable objects. They're constantly appearing and disappearing. If you think to use your example of the beats per minute, there is memory forming when we hear a beat, when we hear like a sound, right? That creates an imprint, a short-term imprint, but it goes away after a certain time. Like, you're not going to remember a beat that you heard, 10 seconds ago, necessarily, right? And that can be modeled by the stability of certain components in the co-regulator. I think.
Mhm.
So basically you have this lower bound and upper bound, and the time step has to fit inside these bounds in order to qualify as the period or the time step, right? Because let's say if you wait too long, then the elements that you need will have faded away. They won't be around for you to use them to make an update, to have an effect.
Mhm.
If you go too quickly, you don't have enough time to decode and regulate and encode. You don't have enough time to register the phenomena that you need
Because
to
you
formalize.
realize that, I mean, I'm pushing this first because, one thing that I always liked about Badiou's theory of generic and so on is that he totally bypassed the problem of end of history. Are we living like the cancellation of the future, like that Mark Fisher stuff? Because for him, it's not that there is history and then you organize and do politics, that you do politics and because of that there is history, right? So you get an intrinsic sense of political time because you're doing things. You shouldn't expect that time to exist on its own. Like for him, there is no such thing as history because of that. And it's funny because it's a kind of more radical version of Hegel's theory, where you only have history because you have written culture in states, which is a way of saying like you need to be able to regulate yourself, to detach the meaningfulness of that rhythm from just regular physical time, right? So the reflexivity of creating a constitution and then it doesn't match the real life of people, and then this leads to contradiction with the state, this leads to changes, like that rhythm, which is a rhythm of regulation, right? Reflexive regulation of people through their states, which requires writing, requires for Hegel memory, right? That's the birth of history for Hegel.
Like another 30 minutes, an hour.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, what you're saying, you're just getting to the interesting point about Hegel.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like for Hegel, you have this, right? I mean, the theory of history in Hegel is all about you need some conditions, the basic two conditions. You need writing. For him, all people that have history have writing in some level, which is a very specific type of writing as well, which is not condensed poetic writing, but prose writing, in fact, which is an interesting kind of qualification. And second, that there is some level of reflexivity, right, through which you pose your laws. You have some written, like the simplest form is you write down your own history, and then you find inside that report something about you you didn't know, right? And to the point that then there's the development of this into the state, like you have laws, and the laws contradict the people's kind of actual behavior, and this leads to changes and so on. But history is kind of an effect of this. That's why you can have people without history for him. So there is already in Hegel this idea that there is a organizational principle that precedes this kind of directed historical movement, right? Which for him kind of coincides with the history of the state. And if, interestingly enough, for Badiou is an effect, is a multiple principle. There is no one history, just as there is in the history of the state. History is kind of the politically meaningful time of whatever political process that is going on. But all of them have this idea that there is an objective world time, right?
Yeah.
Which is not the same as physical chronological time.
Yeah, exactly. We could say that at the level of the whole system, there you have this kind of abstract time, or this chronological time, but really what exists, what's efficacious is the temporality of co-regulators, like the state, and things that are actually making changes or directing the system in the end. Those things have their own sense of time. They also have their own landscapes, which characterize their perception or everything available to them. So you can have things lost, right? If no co-regulator sees you, then you effectively don't exist, right? So there's a sense of like, what is the inexistent of a system? It's something that doesn't enter into the landscape of any co-regulator. But yeah, also memory should be thought of in the social sense. It should be thought of as writings or cultural productions, right? There are actual things produced by these co-regulators that become the memory. So memory is not some abstract like thing, but it's a collection of the collection of writings, the collection of records that you have. And it's appropriate to every system, right? There's a memory in the physical sense of a body, but there's also memory in like the social world, which, like you said, it's like a construction from the co-regulator of the state. It's not something that just existed always. Yeah, so you have the elements here to describe like a history in the broad sense. And yeah, so the question is, depending on whatever co-regulator you're in, you have to define what is the present for that co-regulator, what determines the thickness of a step, and that is determined by these three things, right? These decoding, regulation, and encoding portions. And really, I mean, I thought this part was a bit like, I don't know if it makes sense to say that's always these three steps in this order. Maybe you have something where you're not decoding anything, you're only regulating and encoding.
Yeah, I think that the like contemporary cognitive science, like with these predictive processing models of cognition, like they suggest that much of the time you're kind of getting the most economical way of defining cognition is actually quite counterintuitive, where you're actually projecting much more into the world in anticipation and then measuring the error and learning from it, than actually learning from the environment all the time and encoding it into yourself and then acting.
Yeah.
So predictive, the idea that you're constantly predicting the future, acting on that prediction, and then updating our model when your priors were wrong, right?
Yeah, that makes more sense.
That's the most economic way for cognition to work, and that's how they're building models today. But I mean, I think that's talking about a very, 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 very complex system. That doesn't mean that, that should kind of be like the case for everything. So
yeah.
The thing that I'm interested here also is that, I mean, we ultimately want to apply this to talk about social organizations, and of course there's a lot of, they're built on very highly sophisticated cognitive agents, which are people. You can explain a lot away in terms of the people themselves, as if, let's say, the memory of an organization is ultimately the memory of the people who are organized, but that's not really true. And furthermore, the Hegelian theory of history was precisely the idea that, well, you need a collective memory, right? Things are stored in laws, stored in written history. That doesn't coincide with a person's particular cognitive capacities, right? So I would be interesting to understand what are the basic principles of what counts as a memory, because I feel like that's quite relevant for the way we've been talking about political ecologies and mediations, where you want to know where the constraints on a political organization come from. And we've been saying like, well, they come from the constraints that you need to abide in order to belong to this ecology. And through that, something is passed along over time, right? Like you organize a new occupation of a school in a certain way because you learn from previous ones, or at least you're repeating previous ones, or you're choosing strategies based on what other political movements did or didn't do, right? So in some way, in that way, there is a kind of a collective memory going on that's stored in, I mean, might be stored in many ways, but it's not really the same thing as being stored in people's heads, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So it would be nice to understand what would qualify as a memory so we can also apply that to other concepts.
Yeah, maybe that can be for the next meeting, we can go into that chapter. But yeah, I get the impression that it's very based on like a biological reading of memory, as like basically what the receptors send over time gets imprinted in the memory. So it's kind of like a
So basically, memory, the crucial concept is that it's an imprint that therefore makes some trait available for future time, like some distinguished links, kind of some pattern remain over time because they're imprinted somewhere.
Exactly, yeah. I think there's different parts of the memory. There's procedural memory, which is like skills or actions. Like if I'm gonna sue somebody, like I need to know like what are my options, right? So I talk to the lawyer says you can sue them on these bases for these types of arguments would work. And these precedents are taken into account. So there's a procedural memory. There's also the memory of what the world is, the state of the world. And then I think there's a third one, which I forget now. So the memory has different registers. But in this diagram here, the only part of the memory, well, the two parts of the memory that I'm talking about are the memory that's required to construct the landscape and the memory of procedures from which the co-regulator selects one of those procedures and sends to the effector. But yeah, it doesn't, at least at this point, I don't know how they construct memory over time. I think that's an important missing thing here. Okay, so once we understand this temporality, we can get to what you were mentioning, the anticipation. So the co-regulator constructs a landscape, but this is not enough to make an action. The co-regulator also needs to construct what's called the anticipated landscape, which is what it thinks the world will be after it has performed a certain action, after it has sent a certain procedure. So there is a functor from the landscape to the anticipated landscape. And then the problem is that depending on how good your original landscape is, and also depending on a lot of other things, you may not construct a very accurate anticipated landscape, right? You can be wrong. So this is where we get into kind of the idea of a fracture, or the idea of like being wrong over long periods of time. What does that do to the system, right? What happens when the co-regulator does not have an accurate perception of the world? So yeah, I wrote here, you can talk about the procedural memory. So that's the set of things you can do that's in memory. And then the operational lag is how long it takes to do something. And then you can form new procedures from old ones. So you don't necessarily need to be stuck with the procedures you had before. You can develop new procedures. And And the example here would be a group of plaintiffs working with their lawyer to sue the state. So there's a step here which is legal discovery. So figuring out everything the state does, if they, they're responsible for something, some injustice, then the legal discovery is when you construct your case, which is your landscape. Then the lawyers are both the receptors and the effectors, right? They're partially, right? They're not the only thing that are the receptors, but they can interpret the state of the case for the plaintiffs, because they can interpret the laws and the decisions. They're also the effectors, because when you have something you want to do, you have to go to the lawyer to say, like, I need you to turn this into a legal document, or turn this into some argument in the case. And then there's a sense of memory, which is the complete set of precedents, outcomes of past cases, admissible procedures. All that is stored in the legal memory. But here the important thing is also that you have anticipation. So you don't really act without constructing something internally that should be what is the effect of your action. And then once you have your anticipated landscape, you can measure the difference between the anticipated and the actual using a comparison functor. The comparison functor is a map or a functor that goes between the category of the anticipated landscape to the category of the landscape in the next step. So after your commands have been sent to the effectors, the world has changed, and now you're trying to measure, did I get it right? Did the co-regulators landscape match? Did the anticipated landscape match what actually happened? And then this information can be then stored back into memory. So in this diagram here, there's an arrow from the landscape on the right to the memory. That's the writing back to memory now.
Why is the effector not kind of stretched beyond it's not necessary that it exists after the action?
Yeah, it does exist still. I just didn't stretch it.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's interesting for social systems and political systems that if you do actions and you don't survive your own actions, you can't really compare, right, what you planned with what happened.
Mm-hmm. You mean if the co-regulator dies?
Yeah, right. I mean, if this system of you interacting with the world, you try something out, but trying something out also implies dismantling what you're doing, right? For example, organizing a protest and then there is no organization after the protest. The protest itself kind of exhausts the organization.
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing left on the other side to either learn from the protest, to compare with something anticipated, right? I mean, it's interesting to think about endurance, political endurance, in terms of something that also is a condition for political actions to leave an imprint.
Yeah, something needs to, if you want to leave an imprint in the memory, you need a way to take this anticipated landscape and turn that into some learning, right? Something that can be recorded into the memory. Also,
I mean, I'm saying this because I think, for example, a classic reproach to this would say, but it's left in the memory of people, like people who participated, they recall it. Like, but once you have this complexity approach where some things are not reducible, right, to the experience of the parts that compose it, there probably is a correlate to this, to memory itself, right? I mean, there's something perhaps, I mean, I'm not sure if they go into this, I imagine they don't, but like perhaps there's something like we could call like a complex memory, in the sense that if you have complex links in a structure, meaning they are, you, when you ramify them to their decompositions, you lose something. That if you only can store memory at the lower level, there is no complex object that also stores memory, you will always lose relevant information. You always have a faulty memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
See my point? Like there is an interesting idea there. Like
that I think that's really important. Yeah, that if memory is a complex object itself, then the patterns you store in it may include or may eventually form complex links.
mm-hmm.
Like what if you store patterns into the memory over time, but then you're not necessarily storing the complex links between the memories. The links between the memories can be some other process that, like, some other process exists to make those links. And eventually, first there are simple links between memories, which are links between memories that can be explained by the underlying patterns.
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe there are complex links in the memories that cannot be explained by the.
I think we could even come up with an example at some point. Like I can imagine, developing like two narratives: a narrative of a political process from the standpoint of the individuals, and they record the stuff they go through, right? But if they're part of organizations that are sufficiently complex, meaning that what the organizations are doing is not reducible to what individuals are doing, it kind of stands to reason that the narratives from individuals won't capture something, right, that the narrative of the organizational process would describe.
Yeah.
Right, something like this.
Yeah. The question is, what is the memory of the organizational process, independent of the individuals, right? I mean, in what form does that take? Mm-hmm. Is it writing? Because if it's a writing, you can say, well, it's the writing of an individual who was part of that process, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was even thinking because I think it goes back to very, this whole thing you're presenting, I think it has one of the things that makes it hard is that sometimes it becomes easier for me to find analogies with really, really complex things. Like you say memory, I think of like human memory. But then you're talking about like a heart has a memory, like a muscle memory or something like this, which is actually, or strategies for, very simple organisms. It's not intentional at all. Like it's just like chemistry is narrowing the set of possible options, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes I feel like my mind goes to very simple systems. Sometimes it goes to very sophisticated ones to find analogies. And perhaps the memory we're looking for to talk about organizational memory is actually closer to the simple than to the complex. Like, for example, if you waste resources, your time resources, or, like I feel like this is how I see political memory in my friends and people around me the most. Like it actually has a lot to do with trauma as well. Like when I look at old militants, most of the time they don't tell me anything meaningful about the political history they were part of. Like they didn't store any lessons. Mm-hmm. But their life choices are clearly shaped by their militancy.
Yeah.
Right. So that kind of is where the imprints actually carry over to the present. Like if I ask them, why are you doing this? They're obliged to recall, well, I didn't have a kid at this time because I was, in prison, or this happened because I decided to change countries this moment, like things like this. So clearly there is some political memory there because those imprints of those decisions carry over to the present. But that's not a narrative, a political narrative. They're not able to like tell me anything when you ask them like, okay, what were you doing in the Workers' Party? And they, like, there's no decision they would make in the future based on that, like, and nothing to teach younger generations and so on. So I feel like there is a very basic sense, the same way that a tissue can be hurt and then it won't stretch in a certain direction, and that's kind of memory, right?
Yeah.
You can get that feeling, like it's just a set of kind of constraints violently imposed on a tissue or a texture, which is not the same as like having this plastic relation with something written that you go back and you read it and then you change it and so on, right? More articulated thing. So rather than this sophisticated kind of record and read sort of model of memory based on writing, you can have like this much simpler constraint imposing constraints that are passed along because you have like scars, right?
Yeah, traces of something.
Traces like that.
certain.
Yeah, I would say that that's like a place where you can find organizational memory. Like people don't know what happened in their organizations. They just know they shouldn't be talking to some person. You know, that happens like so often. Like,
is there not a sense? Hello.
Hey, man.
Hey.
Do you not think there's a sense in which the unsubstantial memory is passed on? You said there's nothing that these old battered militants can pass on in substantial terms to younger generations. But I wonder whether that contentless memory is itself passed on as a form of memory. What I mean by that is the children of militants themselves bear a sort of frame of what happened without necessarily being able to share in the content. I say that from personal experience as well, as a child of exile. And I suppose that there is something of memory in that is carried over. It's not memory, I suppose, in the way that you're discussing it, but it seems to me relevant nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I would call it unsubstantial, and I'm also not suggesting that you wouldn't have anything to learn from. It's just that it's quite amazing. For example, in Brazil, we have like one of the largest political experiences of like a workers' party in the world, and the kind of coefficient of lessons learned for new militant projects is very small. But the life of many people were changed by this process. So there is like one sense in which this leaves a mark, so you can clearly kind of see traces of it, but they don't work in the same sense that, let's say, writing this down so we can access later on and not repeat the same things. It's not really in that sense that it exists, right? So at least for most of it, like I'm just trying to understand how we can think of a memory that is imprinted in the world, that's political, it has to do with organizations and so on. It's imprinted in the world without having to be people singular, individual agents, cognitive storage. Of course, like many people have like personal memories, but how is this kind of collective process kind of stored in reality, right?
Yeah, I suppose I was just pointing to the affective element that is inherited or nonetheless passed down, even while the actual the substance of an event that was lived by a previous generation is more or less lost. And so what you end up getting is a sort of nostalgic memory with the content that no longer exists. I say that, with, for example, a poster on the wall there that I have of the movement that my mother and father were part of in the middle, and I don't have any substantial engagement with what was going on in those years when they were part of that movement. but I have a sort of nostalgic relationship, which nonetheless feels like part of a memory. It's not really what we'd colloquially speak of as memory, but it does seem to be sufficiently connected to memory to be part of it itself.
Yeah, definitely that makes sense. And I think this we have here some tools to describe it, like because memory is a subcategory of the overall evolutive system, it has it can have its own hierarchy, it can have its own links. So there's nothing that says we can't have like a what's it called, like a lower level or less active forms of memory that maybe can become active later on, right? Maybe there are links that can develop between these inactive scars or traces of things. Maybe the pattern just needs something like a co-limit or some object to appear that can activate them and allow for new interactions between memory. And maybe in fact, all memory is like that. Like memory is latent until something happens that makes it interact with other things. Maybe there's not a co-regulator that's able to read and write to that aspect of the memory yet, but later on there can be. And really, psychoanalysis is like that, right? Isn't psychoanalysis about taking memory that was inactive and making it active in a sense, and then you are writing to it because you're reconfiguring that memory and giving it new associations, and you're reading from it. Obviously, in the clinic, you're speaking about it. So it's not guaranteed, like the patterns in memory are not guaranteed to be useful, but they're also not guaranteed to be totally useless and like separated from the rest of the system. It just depends on what co-regulators exist that can interact with that memory.
Yeah, but for example, just to give an example of a difference there, let's say, to use an example from Brazil, like there are parties where there are tensions between kind of trends inside the party. These trends ultimately fight. And this is an organizational process that happens. Like there was a scission inside this party and one of them leaves the party, right? Now you want to know what memory is this connected to? And I feel like on the one level, there is, let's say, there might be texts written about this. There is explanations of why this happened. There are, decisions to be made in terms of who's going to follow the current that left the party and who's going to stay inside and so on. But there is a level, because all of these are people relating to each other, where you can just translate this back to the fact that now this guy doesn't speak to that guy, right? And this affects, let's say, the personal history of people. Let's say people who are friends of both of them had to choose a side. Now they speak to one of them, don't speak to the other. And even though the one thing is an effect of the other, the organizational process causes, right, or is necessary to explain why those two people don't talk anymore and why the friend had to choose sides. But just choosing side between your two friends doesn't capture much information about the organizational process that happened. So it's a consequence that now leaves a trait in your history. It can be a positive or a negative one, like because of what happened in Cuban Revolution, there are many Che Guevara t-shirts. I can have a Che Guevara t-shirt, but that doesn't mean from the Che Guevara t-shirt, I'll know much about the Cuban Revolution, right? So it is a constraint that might be passed along, but it can be kind of compressed to the point that you no longer can recuperate the patterns that were at stake, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can compare that, for example, with the fact that until today, we know a lot about the October Revolution and how strategies were made, or about the Cuban Revolution and how their decision to start from a certain place rather than the city, right, was this, how this came about and the effects of this in that context. And people can still refer to this and they think about how to act, right? For example, Cultural Revolution in China, amongst many things, it also names that, well, remember that when you take power, that doesn't mean that the fight is over. You might need to restructure the whole party after that. That's a different type of memory. Like, whose memory is that? It's no one's. Like, but the pattern survives, right? So you can access something about the organizational unfolding later on. It's different from kind of the imprints that this leaves, but that you can only then reconstruct them in the context of personal histories, you know? Like, I feel like there is also like a hierarchical shift there between this kind of complex memory at the level where the patterns were actually at work, and a projection back to the level of more constituent parts. And then you get like traits of these things.
Yeah, but isn't the traits just the pattern without the co-limit?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah, because that to me it seems like the co-limit is the collective links of the co-limit would be naming the causal past of, like, if I stop talking to a group of people because of a political event or a decision, then the collective links from my lack of friendship with them to that history, that point in history, that if that goes away, then I'm left with just the fact that I'm not friends with them, and then I don't have the co-limit anymore to bind those traces of my life. So yeah, the memory, yeah, I wonder what that means. I think there are different levels to the memory that may disappear over time, as well as reappear.
You know, like, for example, I would oppose, I mean, I agree with the principle. I just think it's interesting to have that distinction because, for example, it's not uncommon that just after a new political process emerges, we know how to read a previous one, right? So, like, once you have like the Zapatistas, you can look back at popular peasant revolts and think of them differently, because now you get to interact with the past. Like, now you remember something like this, you know?
Yeah.
So like that idea is what I would like to think about. Like, just as we're talking about hierarchy, like you started with this, right? You started with this more synchronous idea where we were talking about things like this, right? Where you have a cone for a pattern in a lower level, and we realize that we can have like theories of multiple levels. Then you shifted around and you started talking about, yeah, this same principle kind of applies to sections of these things and as they move in time, right? But now there's also the interesting questions of how the two things connect, right? So there might be information at this level, this level here, which I cannot recuperate at this level here. So there might be memory that is, you know, a mixture of level and a duration that is here, that is not accessible at this level. So things like this start to make sense, like to say something like, you know, people can recall a political movement, but they might not be able to individually take any lessons from it because the actual patterns of the political movement are of a higher complexity than the individuals that compose it. That means that you would need other political movements to have similar complexity so that they can actually learn from their past history, whereas people cannot learn from this history here because it's a different level of complexity. You know, like it gives off the idea that things like, it probably would take a national revolutionary movement of the size of like some Soviet Union stuff, so that we can actually settle accounts with bad decisions of the Soviet Union. Whereas like small collectives cannot learn anything from a process that is much more complex than they are.
Yeah.
Like something in that direction seems to become a bit more tractable.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you're onto something here. The thing you were saying, a while back, you mentioned the commission on the like state violence.
Yeah, exactly. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. You have to build this commission. You have to build something at the level of the state to construct a co-limit for the traces of state violence that don't really have a name, right? Like you need a new name for it because the old name doesn't work because the regime before has disappeared. So there's nothing that binds the different traumas that were created back then. And so you create the commission, and then you're able to I don't know, maybe write something to memory that can serve as the solution to the binding problem of the trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing I want. I mean, of course, we don't need to be able to move further because we're still trying to understand the concepts here. But I just like the idea that when you have this homogeneity between the synchronous layering of complex structures, and then the same tools help you to think about their diachronic development. Now you have this rich hierarchy in kind of space and time, right? And you can now ask about this sort of correlations, like, okay, I want to update through time, but I mean, even like classic, post-war historiography, like with Brodel and the idea of long duration time versus lived experience of time, like they already suggested that, well, there are things that are just the thickness of like periods are very long, and history happens very quick in between those two things, but doesn't really affect this longer period. So it seems like these things can come together somehow.
Yeah, definitely. That's very interesting way of approaching it. I think also, it fits a lot of the things we've been like. Memory is not some inactive. It's not just a latent set of patterns, but it has this. It is like a key resource in a way for the co-regulator, and the power of the memory depends on what aspects of it can be bound together, maybe.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back a bit to that like when we read like Lillian's text, and it ends with this idea of a kind of repository of memory of past collective strategies for solving workers' problems. I'm not sure if you recall that. Right, and it seemed like, okay, she's touching on something that's similar to what we're calling like this political ecology that passes along behaviors that political organizations both need to use to become part of that ecology, but also are allowed to use to solve their problems in the world, right? And this thing here is integrating a bit better, like the scalar hierarchy through which individuals become organizations that become part of the world, and the memory point of view through which, well, whatever strategies, whatever links you create to become an organization, they need to endure in time. And that endurance is connected with like a weird kind of repository of patterns, right? Which is kind of a very basic sense of memory.
Yeah. No, I like that. Yeah. A memory point of view for this patterns. Yeah. I mean, they basically they correlate, right? The effectiveness of the co-regulator and the development of the memory. They seem to have a close tie.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you see any connection between these operators and the triad we've been using of action spaces, constraints, and reductions?
Yeah, the admissible procedures, which are stored in memory, that's basically your action space. And there's a distinction between what can be done, I think, and what the co-regulator thinks can be done, right? I mean, obviously the action space, you can do whatever. It's like an infinite action space, but really what's admissible, what's actually possible is something that you get from memory. And then they talk about in the book, they talk about the production of new procedures from old ones. So there is something
so you
like
wouldn't associate action space with strategy. You would associate it with.
Yeah, admissible. I would associate it with admissible because the strategy is more of a like God's eye view of the whole system
Okay.
and how the whole system evolves. So yeah, there is a space of possible, and maybe that's why they end up using the term option instead of strategy. I like the term strategy because it seemed relevant to politics. So I use that, but they said at some point they stopped using strategy and moved to this idea of an option, in the sense of there's many options for how the system will evolve, and depending on a lot of things, one option will be taken, but it's not as intentional. But the admissible procedures are the things that the co-regulator intends to happen. Okay, obviously for some complex co-regulator, not like the heart. But they say that the choosing of the admissible procedure is where they find the final cause in Rosen's Rosen's like sense, or Aristotle's sense, right? Like goal-oriented behavior appears when you're choosing the admissible procedure.
Okay, and the landscapes would be like the reduction.
Yeah, landscape's definitely the reduction. Constraints are a bit different. I mean, constraints are a bit complicated because you may not have an accurate picture of your constraints. So you have to distinguish between constraints you can perceive, which are part of the landscape, and the constraints which are effective in the system but are not transmitted to the co-regulator. Like the co-regulator doesn't see those constraints. No. Maybe that's what learning is anyway. Like you have a landscape of constraints. You may only perceive one, but then you try something and it doesn't work. Then you have to figure out what is it in your landscape that was missing. And then because of that, you have to absorb other constraints.
It's interesting. It almost sounds the inverse of what we thought. We were saying like you learn information about the world because you try something out, and then some of it is you fail, like it's constrained by the world. So the difference between what you try and what you get tells you something about the world. Now, what you seem to be saying is that I have information about the world and I try something based on that information. And the difference between my anticipated landscape and the information I actually get tells me something about the constraint. Constraints seem to be indirect, right?
Yeah, the constraint is, I mean, I'm not sure I understand the difference between the two you said there, because they both involve some anticipation. they both involve the actual state of the world. And it's the difference between the anticipated and the actual, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, it's true. Perhaps it's not that crucial.
in order to try something, I need already a picture of what I think will happen. And then when it happens, then, or if it doesn't happen, then the difference will be written to memory, and then that forms a new procedure potentially to choose from.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. The last few slides are much more interesting, I think, but I don't know if we can get to them in time. I really want to talk about this one, which is my description of capitalist crises and how they occur from the interaction of different parts of the capitalist world. I can quickly talk about this one, which is basically that there's this thing called the effector, which is the thing that carries out the different procedures. So in the case of the legal world, it would be the court system. So you have two co-regulators. One is like the defendant, one is the prosecutor, or maybe two parties in court. They send their procedures to the same effector. The effector is what ends up deciding the outcome, and the effector is what eventually translates to the strategy that evolves the system. But the problem is different co-regulators have different goals. So there can be a conflict, right? If two different co-regulators send different procedures to the effector, there must be some process by which you can integrate these procedures together to form the strategy. So some decision-making process or some random process. They mention like this is where they would fit game theory into in the context of social analysis. You would have like a game theory model here in the effector, and then the actions of the different parties would go to the effector. The effector would decide, what is the optimum strategy, or what is the payoff of the strategy. But you need something, right? It's not they don't commit to game theory. They just say that would be one possible way. But you need something to adjudicate the different procedures. And then here we have the idea of a fracture, which is really interesting. Basically, when you have a discrepancy between the anticipated landscape and the actual landscape, if that cannot be resolved, it creates a fracture. So basically the co-regulator loses touch with reality, and the later landscapes also become more and more decoupled from the actual system. I tried to map this onto like a crisis of overproduction, in the sense that both labor and capital have a landscape that is formed by the prices given to us by the market. So there are the price of labor, and there's the price of goods, right? Means of production and means of consumption. I drew these arrows as showing in time like a step. In the first step, labor goes to the market, tries to sell itself as labor power. Individual capital is seeing constantly the input from the market, and also it's outputting information to the market. And then eventually labor will get back some wages from the market for its time that it spends. And then there's a fracture here because the anticipated landscape it has to do not with how much they were paid, but with the value of their labor. So I was trying to map the disjunction between value of labor power and wages that were paid for the labor. I was trying to map that distinction onto the distinction between the landscape and the anticipated landscape. I'm not sure. This is just kind of a suggestion for future research. But if we're able to do that mapping, then we can say that the wage relation is a fracture, and the fracture at that level of a smaller co-regulator can bubble up to cause a crisis in the larger sense of capitalism and the crisis of overproduction, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. But I mean, I think that's already something. It's a good topic for meeting next week, also to try to sketch, ways of bringing this to like social systems more directly. I would just like to kind of unpack this a bit more.
Yeah, it's too dense right now.
But it's very interesting, man. I mean, yeah, I think today it became much clearer to me how much, like, considering both the synchronic and diachronic things, and I mean the exact definition of co-regulators, I'm gonna look back at the book because I know there's some specific kind of set of operations that need to happen so that you can have something that actually filters through strategies based on memory and so on. I don't follow it yet. But regardless of that, like the way that these two levels, synchronic and the diachronic, interact, and you get like complexity levels on one and then complexification structures on the other, like it become much clearer in how we could use this in our favor.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the missing thing. I mean, everything up until now, we've kind of been choosing one or the other, either synchronic description or a diachronic one, in the form of like Renzo's. I feel like Renzo's presentation was all about it was getting us towards the diachronic at the end with the concept of unfolding. Also, his concept of boundaries, like using topology, that's kind of a synchronic description as well. So it kind of had both there, but yeah, I think now we can go further and try to combine the two more intrinsically.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, so maybe we can stop here since this is the most complicated one.
Yeah.
There's two more slides, but I think we can start next time.
Yeah. No, man, but this was amazing.
Yeah, thanks for staying, and
I'll glue the two parts of the video before I upload them. So there.
Is there a second part? Are we recording still?
Yeah. I had it all. Okay, guys, Juliano, good to see you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for joining.
Very interesting, Dennis. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sort of still lurking in the background for most of the time.
Don't worry, lurking is allowed.
Definitely allowed.
See ya.
Thanks. All right, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.